Good afternoon, students. Today is Tuesday, 30 March 2021. This is our third lecture on John Hardwig's essay entitled, Is There a Duty to Die? The exam will be on Thursday, 2 days from now. I've been telling you for several lectures now. The exam is on the 1st of April. That's the date that's on the syllabus and the reading list, and I'm sticking to it. The exam will be available from 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening on Thursday, the 1st of April, 2 days from now. And when you go in to take the exam, you have 75 minutes to complete it. So make sure once you get started, make sure you're ready to go and make sure you answer all of the questions before you log out. And take note of your score. I've had a number of students tell me that they don't know their score or have forgotten their score. Others of you know your score. So I assume, since I haven't been in taking an exam, I assume that as soon as you end your exam, you can see your score on the exam. So make a note of it, write it down somewhere. Other comments about the exam, the format is the same, which means 10 true-false questions and 30 multiple choice questions. The content is different, of course. If you look at the reading list, you'll see that the second exam covers the following items. It covers the New Mexico Supreme Court case Morris versus Brandenburg on the question of whether there's a right to die, a constitutional right to die. Then we just spent one day on Hippocrates discussing his oath. We then moved on to Ra'anan Gillen, who discussed 4 principles of biomedical ethics. And now we're finishing up the essay by John Hardwig. So the exam covers 4 items. You're responsible for not only everything I say in my lectures, you're responsible for all of the readings and any handouts that are posted on Canvas that don't say optional reading. If something says optional reading, then of course it's optional. You don't have to read it. I won't test you on it, but you're free to read it, and I encourage you to read it. That's why I post it. In fact, I'm going to post a second article by John Hardwig in a few days for you to read. I'll probably wait until the exam is over so you're not confused by it. Hardwig wrote a follow-up article many years after this original article was published, and he discusses the effect that it had and changes in his thinking. So I'll post that in the next couple of days. And as soon as the exam is over, probably a week from today, I will post my latest lecture on the next item. It'll be by David Shaw. I'm going to post the article by Shaw in the next couple of days so you can read it before next week. And I think I'll post my lecture notes for you and a handout that I prepared. So I have 3 things to post on Canvas that have to do with the next reading. But you shouldn't be thinking about that right now. You need to be focusing on the second exam 2 days from now. And there'll be time after that to get started on the next reading. Okay, now, I neglected to mention a few things in our earlier discussions, and since this is the last lecture before the exam, I want to make sure I go over them at some point. So I'm going to take a few minutes right now to do so. First of all, I'm not sure whether I discussed what are called advance directives. So let me explain the basic idea and the types of advance directive. And there may be a question or two on the exam. So pay attention to what I'm saying. An advance directive, as the name implies, is a directive that somebody gives in advance. So the idea is this: while you are competent to make decisions for yourself, you will do something that has a legal effect that will direct what shall happen if and when you become incompetent. Let me say that again. While you're competent, you will do something that will provide directions should you become incompetent, should you become senile or incapacitated in some way, or should you lapse into a coma. Now, there are different types of advance directive, and here are three of them. The first one is called a living will. You may have heard of that. A living will. Every state allows for this. I have one. You can easily execute a living will if you so desire. You can go online and type in, if you're a resident of Texas, type in Texas Living Will, and you'll see a form, a one-page form. Read it over, and if you want, you can execute it. You can sign it, have it witnessed and dated, and then provide a copy of it to your doctor and to your family. Maybe carry a copy in your automobile should you become involved in an accident. So a living will is like a regular will. In a regular will, someone who is competent specifies or directs who will take his or her property, whether it's real estate or personal property. A living will is similar in that you execute it, it has legally binding effect, and it specifies or directs what will happen should you become incompetent. It may say, for example, you don't want certain life support systems hooked up to you. And if they have been hooked up, you want them removed. Now, as I recall, it's been a while since I looked at it, but the one in Texas does not allow you to specify whatever you want. It has what's called form language. It's a form, and you either have to take it as it is or leave it. You don't get to tinker with it. You don't get to add the special provisions that you prefer to have. It's one size fits all. Okay? So you may not want to execute that for various reasons, but many people have. Okay, now the second type of advance directive is called a power of attorney. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. It's called a power of attorney. It really has nothing to do with attorneys. What it means is that you have designated someone to make decisions in your behalf should you become incompetent. So you may specify, if you're married, your spouse. If you're not married, maybe you'll specify one or both of your parents to make decisions for you. If you're old and your parents and unmarried and your parents are no longer alive, you may specify a grown child of yours. So you can choose anyone you want. You could even choose someone who's not related to you, your attorney, for example. So the idea is that you, in this legally binding document, you name someone and you give that person the power to make decisions for you once you become incompetent. Now notice how that differs from a living will. In a living will, it's directed to everyone without naming anyone at all, and it says, here's what I would like to have happen should I become incompetent. The power of attorney does name someone, and it says, I'm going to leave the decision making to that person. And of course, that would cover a wide range of issues and topics. Okay, so those are both called advance directives. The third type is a simple DNR order, do not resuscitate. If you are hospitalized, for example, you may inform your caretakers there that should you go into cardiac arrest or some other condition, you do not want to be resuscitated. Okay, so you're specifying now, while you're competent, what will happen should you become incompetent to make a decision. All right, so that's enough for now on those topics. I may have mentioned them in passing, but I want to make sure I'm thorough, and you should expect a question or two on that general topic of advanced directives. And now you're in a position to answer them correctly, however many there happen to be. Okay, another thing that I've mentioned, but I want to just clarify it. It's come up more than once so far this semester. It's a doctrine called the correlativity thesis. Correlativity. It says that two things are correlative to one another. They're co-related. And the two things are rights and duties. So the correlativity thesis has two parts. The first part says that if someone has a right, then at least one other person has a duty. In other words, it says that duties are correlated with rights. The second part says the opposite. It says that if someone has a duty, then at least one other person has a right. So rights and duties are correlated. If one of them exists, so does the other one. Okay, that's called the correlativity thesis. Not everybody accepts it. Some people reject the correlativity thesis. Other people accept it, and they make arguments for and against it. My goal is not to tell you whether I think it's true or false. My goal is to help you understand what it is. Okay, the correlativity thesis says that rights and duties are correlated or correlative. And that means that if one person has a right, then at least one other has a duty. It also says that if one person has a duty, at least one other has a right. Okay, so if there's a question on that, you'll know the answer now. Okay, a couple more things. In the Morris versus Brandenburg case, I will ask you specific questions about how the various judges ruled. So you're going to have to go through and you're going to have to make notes and pay attention. I gave you my own lecture notes, and if you scour them, you'll know the answers to my questions. So let's just do a quick review. There were 3 stages of litigation in the Morris case. There was the trial involved where Asia Riggs and her 2 doctors were the plaintiffs, and they sued 2 agents of the state of New Mexico. Okay, there was the trial stage. And then Asia Riggs won at the trial, so the state appealed to the lower level appellate court, and Asia Riggs lost at that stage. She and her 2 doctors then appealed to the New Mexico Supreme Court. Now, how many judges were there at these 3 levels? At the trial level, there was 1 judge, the trial judge. All right. At the first appellate level, there were 3 judges. It was a 3-judge panel. And at the Supreme Court, there were 5 justices. So 1 plus 3 plus 5 equals 9. There were a total of 9 judges involved in this case at the 3 levels. And I'm going to ask you specific questions. The 2 issues in this case were, does the assisting suicide statute in the state of New Mexico cover or apply to what the plaintiffs call aid in dying, which is physician-assisted suicide? Does it or does it not cover that issue? And the second issue in the cases involved the Constitution, and that is this statute unconstitutional? Does it violate people's rights, people's fundamental rights to due process or to equal protection? Now, each of the 9 judges or justices had an answer to each of the 2 questions. So I want you to know how it came down. How many of the 9 justices ruled that the statute covers aid in dying? Okay? How many exactly? And which ones were they? You don't need to know them by name, but you do need to know how many of the judges, how many of the 9. And secondly, how many of the 9 judges or justices ruled that the statute violates the Constitution of New Mexico? So I'm just giving you advance warning. You need to study that case carefully and know what happened at each of the 3 levels. I will ask specific questions about that. Okay? One other thing that has to do with that legal case, I can't remember honestly whether this came up. It may have come up, but I'd like to just make sure that you understand the difference between overruling a case and reversing a case. And the difference is very easy to remember. You know that the judiciary has a hierarchy, and we just saw an example of it. New Mexico Supreme Court, and then immediately below it is the New Mexico Court of Appeals, and then you have the various trial courts in the state, lots of them. Now, suppose you've got a case that worked its way up to the Supreme Court, as happened in Morris. If the Supreme Court of New Mexico shoots down anything that happened at the below it, that's called reversing. So a higher court will sometimes reverse what happened below. In this case, there were two courts below the Supreme Court. So the New Mexico Supreme Court could reverse what happened at the lower appellate court, or it could reverse what happened at the trial court. It has the power to reverse anything that an inferior court does. So reversal has to do with vertical or hierarchical structure. Okay? A higher level court has the power to reverse what happened below it. Overruling is different. A court sometimes overrules itself. It has nothing to do with courts below it. You overrule yourself. So suppose a particular issue comes to the New Mexico Supreme Court. It may be an issue that's been resolved already in years past. The court may change its mind and overrule its previous decision. That sometimes happens. Now, courts aren't supposed to do that very often. They're supposed to respect precedent. A precedent is a previously decided case in your own jurisdiction. So courts overrule themselves. They reverse courts below them, right? So overruling is horizontal, like this, where you overrule a previous court yourself at a previous time. And reversal is vertical, right, where you reverse what happened below you. So I just wanted to clarify that. There will be a question, perhaps two, on that topic, and now you can get the answer. And I think that's it. I just wanted to clarify a few things. So be prepared to answer questions on any of those things, as well as the rest of my lectures. So let's get back to where we left off. I left a couple of sections of the article by Hardwig to be discussed today. The two main ones, and this is probably all I'll focus on today, the two main ones are objections to the duty to die. Now, Hardwig argues that there is a duty to die, and various people might have objections to that, and we'll see what they are and what Hardwig says in reply to those objections. And then we'll ask a specific question: who exactly has a duty to die? And so you may be wondering right now, does Hardwig think that anybody who's old has a duty to die, or that the older you are, the more likely you are to have a duty to die? Is it age alone that's of concern to him? Maybe it's the fact that you have a terminal illness that matters. Maybe Hardwig is arguing that people who are terminally ill have a duty to die, and only those people. Another possibility is that the duty to die applies to people who are a burden to their loved ones, however old they may be, and even if they don't have a terminal illness. So there are at least three possibilities. We're going to go over some of the factors that Hardwig thinks determine whether you have a duty to die. So let's turn to the objections. I'm looking at the section of the article right here. It's on page 37, and you can see the heading, Objections to a Duty to Die. There are three of them altogether, three different objections. Hardwig disposes of all three. He thinks they're not significant objections. They can be dealt with. They can be replied to. They can be rebutted, however you want to put it. So let's take them one at a time. In the first paragraph, Hardwig gives a short, snappy statement of the objection, and then he goes on to elaborate down below. So let's read the first paragraph where he gives the snappy, pithy version of the objections. Okay, so follow along with your reading. Read along with me. To my mind, Hardwig writes, the most serious objections to the idea of a duty to die lie in the effects on my loved ones of ending my life. But to most others, the important objections have little or nothing to do with family and loved ones. Perhaps the most common objections are, and notice he used numerals 1, 2, and 3, just to make sure you know when one objection ends and the next one starts. Here's the first objection. Some people say that, quote, there is a higher duty that always takes precedence over a duty to die. So that's one way to reply to Hardwig's argument, to object to it, is to say, okay, Hardwig, maybe there is a right to die, but there are other duties that come into play as well. And some of them might work the other way or point the other way, and they may be weightier and more important duties. Okay? Number two, some people say, quote, a duty to end one's own life would be incompatible with a recognition of human dignity or the intrinsic value of a person. And we'll say more about that in a moment. That's enough for now. And here's the third objection. Seriously ill, debilitated, or dying people are already bearing the harshest burdens, and so it would be wrong to ask them to bear the additional burden of ending their own lives. So the idea here is that it's unfair. A duty to die is unfair because the person in question who's being asked to die is already bearing a great burden. How unfair would it be to impose a greater burden, the burden of dying or bringing about your own death? I think the argument there is an argument about fairness. So let's spend a few minutes on each of these objections, kind of unpack it a little bit and see what Hardwig says about it. Okay, let's take the first one. Remember the one that said there's a more important duty pointing in the other direction? I'm still on page 37, first column, down below the paragraph that I just read. Well, let's give Hardwig's second paragraph first. These, he says, are all important objections. All deserve a thorough discussion. Here, I will only be able to suggest some moral counterweights, ideas that might provide the basis for an argument that these objections do not always preclude a right to life. So in that short paragraph, Hardwig says, all of these are important, they deserve discussion, and they deserve rebuttal, and I'm just going to give you the gist of my rebuttal. I'm going to give the counterweight to these objections. So here's the first one. An example of the first line of argument would be the claim that a duty to God, the giver of life, forbids that anyone take her own life. Now, let me interject here. You may have heard this sort of thing. People often say that whether we live or die is up to not us, but to God, our Creator. God determines when and how we die, and perhaps why we die. And it's not up to us. Humans, it is often said, should not play God. Let God play God, and God will. So we should not end our lives because God may have a purpose for us continuing to live, a purpose that we don't understand and cannot see or grasp. Okay, Hardwig continues. It could be argued that this duty always supersedes whatever obligations we might have to our families. But now here's Hardwig starting to criticize this. What convinces us that we always have such a religious duty in the first place? And what guarantees that it always supersedes our obligations to try to protect our loved ones? So Hardwig is not really replying to the objection. He's kind of gesturing in the direction of a reply. He's saying, these are the questions we need to ask if we're confronted with this objection. What's the basis of a religious duty? How do we even know that God exists? Don't we first have to prove the existence of God and prove that God has a plan for human beings? Don't we need to make a case for those things? Don't we need to make a case that the duty to God, even if there is such a duty, is stronger than or outweighs the duty to our loved ones? So those are the kinds of questions that Hardwig thinks need to be answered in order for this objection to work or have any effect. He goes on to say, in one more paragraph on this objection, certainly the view that death is the ultimate evil cannot be squared with Christian theology. It does not reflect the actions of Jesus or those of his early followers, nor is it clear that the belief that life is sacred requires that we never take it, meaning take our lives. There are other theological possibilities. And here he puts in a footnote to explain those. In any case, most of us, bioethicists, physicians, and patients alike, do not subscribe to the view that we have an obligation to preserve life as long as possible. But if not, surely we ought to agree that I may legitimately end my life for other regarding reasons, not just for self-regarding reasons. Now here I think Hardwig has shifted his ground a little bit. He began addressing himself to the religious person who thinks that our lives belong to God and that we shouldn't play God. But then by the end of that second paragraph, he's addressing himself not specifically to people who are religious, but to people perhaps whose minds are not made up yet. People who are open-minded about whether there is a God, people who are open-minded about what God's plan is for human beings, people who are open-minded about whether God always objects to us ending our lives. So that's it. That's not much of a reply to the objection. I hope you can see that. But I don't think Hardwig wanted to spend this whole article discussing his replies to the objections. I think really, and maybe he had a word limit. He may have been told by the editors, you have 5,000 words or 7,000 words. And for Hardwig to have gone into more depth in replying to these objections would have taken him over the limit. So rather than not say anything at all about these objections, he thought perhaps that he would give the gist of his reply, right? Kind of gesture, this is where I would go with this. This is the kind of reply that I would make if I had more space to do so. Okay, let's turn to the second objection. This one is dealt with in just one paragraph at the top of the second column of the same page. Remember, the second objection says that has to do with human dignity. The objection is that taking your life would be an affront to your dignity as a human being. It would treat you as less than fully human. So let's see what Hardwig says in reply to that. He says, religious considerations aside, the claim could be made that an obligation to end one's own life would be incompatible with human dignity, or would embody a failure to recognize the intrinsic value of a person. Okay, that's the objection. Now he's going to start replying to it. He says, but I do not see that in thinking I had a duty to die, I would necessarily be failing to respect myself or to appreciate my dignity or worth. Notice, Hardwig is meeting this objection head on. The objector, the critic, says, wait a minute, killing yourself would be disrespecting yourself. It would be treating yourself as an object. It would be treating yourself as a mere means to your own ends. Right? It would be treating yourself as less than fully human, less than a person. And Hardwig says, no, it wouldn't. He just flat out denies it. Why? Hardwig says, why would ending my life signify that I have no self-respect? Why would ending my life lower my dignity? So let's continue and see what else he says in this paragraph. He says, nor would I necessarily be failing to respect you in thinking that you had a similar duty. There is surely also a sense in which we fail to respect ourselves if in the face of illness or death, we stoop to choosing just what is best for ourselves. Indeed, Kant held that the very core of human dignity is the ability to act on a self-imposed moral law, regardless of whether it is in our interest to do so. He says he will return to the topic of human dignity, but he's given us enough, I think, to show what his reply is. He thinks that ending your life for the following reason, because you've become a burden to your loved ones, ending your life under those conditions shows full respect for yourself as a person. It does not reduce your dignity. If anything, he might say, it enhances your dignity. because you're the one making this awesome choice. Maybe it's an awful choice, right? You're the one making it. How is that not an exercise of your autonomy? Of course, he's assuming you're competent to make this decision. You're still autonomous. So choosing to end your life after deliberating about it, after taking into account not only your own interest, but the interest of your loved ones, that's an exalted, respectable exercise of your autonomy. Far from forfeiting your autonomy and your dignity, this is an exercise of it. This is an application of it. This is a carrying out of it. So that's all Hardwig says about the second objection, but you can see where he would go with this. A lot more could be said, and I'm sure if he had the space, he would say more. But I think at this point, he just wants to sketch out his reply so that the reader can take it from there. The third objection, if you go back to originally, is that it's unfair to ask people who are already struggling with hardships because of disease or aging to end their lives, to give it all up for the sake of their loved ones. How is that fair? You're already heavily burdened with pain and disability, perhaps, so isn't it unfair, maybe wrong, to ask you to make an additional sacrifice by ending your life? Here's Hardwig's objection to that. First, he states the objection, then he replies to it. A third objection appeals to the relative weight of burdens and thus ultimately to considerations of fairness or justice. The burdens that an illness creates for the family could not possibly be great enough to justify an obligation to end one's life. The sacrifice of life itself would be a far greater burden than any involved in caring for a chronically ill family member. So that's the objection. Right? He hasn't started replying yet. The objection is, this is unfair. Right? The family isn't suffering nearly as much as you are, and to ask you to end your life for their sake is just to heap an additional burden on you. How can that be fair or just or right? Here is Hardwig's response to that. He says, is this true? Consider the following case. No, I'm not sure whether this is an actual case or hypothetical. It really doesn't matter because hypothetical cases can still make the point, whether they're actual or not. Because we can ask ourselves, what would we say if this were to actually happen? So here we go. An 87-year-old woman was dying of congestive heart failure. Her Apache score predicted that she had less than a 50% chance to live for another 6 months. She was lucid, assertive, and terrified of death. Now that we're to understand that she's competent. She's still autonomous. She very much wanted to live and kept opting for rehospitalization and the most aggressive life-prolonging treatment possible. That treatment successfully prolonged her life, though with increasing debility, for nearly 2 years. Her 55-year-old daughter was her only remaining family, her caregiver, and the main source of her financial support. The daughter duly cared for her mother, but before her mother died, her illness had cost the daughter all of her savings, her home, her job, and her career. Okay, that's the fact situation. Here's Hardwig again. This is by no means an uncommon sort of case. All right, so don't dismiss this as very rare or fantastical, otherworldly. Not at all, Hardwig says. This happens often. It's common. You may not hear about it, but that doesn't mean it's not occurring. Thousands of similar cases occur each year. Now, Hardwig says, ask yourself which is the greater burden. A, to lose a 50% chance of 6 more months of life at age 87, because that's the burden that's that would be imposed on the mother if she were to end her life. B, to lose all your savings, your home, and your career at age 55. Which burden would you prefer to bear? That's one way to answer the question. Which of those burdens would you prefer to bear? I suspect you'd prefer to bear burden A over B. Do we really believe the former is the greater burden? Would even the dying mother say that A is the greater burden? Or has she been encouraged to believe that the burdens of B are somehow morally irrelevant to her choices? So this is just an example of many that could be given to show the overwhelming effect on one's loved ones of continuing to live when you have become a burden. Now, Hardwig doesn't tell us how this woman is supposed to die. Is she supposed to go see it? If she lives in a state like Oregon or California, one of the few states that allow physician-assisted suicide, is she supposed to go see a doctor and start the procedure whereby she gets a lethal dose of a drug that she can then take to end her life? If she doesn't live in a state like that, what can she do? What should she do? What must she do? She can, at a minimum, refuse medical treatment that will keep her alive. Everyone has a right to refuse medical treatment, legally and morally. So if she's ever in a situation where she is sick, she can specify to her healthcare providers, don't resuscitate me, don't hook me up to machines. If you've already hooked me up to machines, take them off. In other words, she can passively die. She can request to be allowed to die, which is different from requesting that someone kill you or help you kill yourself. Now, Hardwig doesn't go into the details, but I think that's what he would say. This woman has a duty to die, and that may mean anything from requiring that machines be removed or withdrawn or withheld, to going to see a doctor about a lethal injection if she lives in a state like Oregon. Okay, he has additional comments. Let me see how much. I think I may stop reading there. I think that's enough. Look at the final paragraph of this section, though. It's revealing. Hardwig writes, I can readily imagine that through cowardice, rationalization, or failure of resolve, I will fail in this obligation to protect my loved ones. If so, I think I would need to be excused or forgiven for what I did. Now that's a little bit ambiguous. I think what he means to say there is, if I fail to do my duty, that's wrong. And that calls for being forgiven. I need to be excused for it because it's wrong. You don't need to be excused for something unless you did something wrong. And you don't need to be forgiven unless you wronged someone. So that's what he's saying there, is if I, through cowardice, rationalization, or failure of resolve, if I fail to do my duty, then I'm in a situation where I need to ask for forgiveness from my loved ones on whom I've imposed a burden, and I need to be excused. I need to cite some reason that excuses my behavior because I have failed to do my duty. He says, I cannot imagine it would be morally permissible for me to ruin the rest of my partner's life to sustain mine, or to cut off my sons' careers, impoverish them, or compromise the quality of their children's lives because I wish to live a little longer. This is what leads me to believe in a duty to die. So notice, it's revealing. Hardwig is saying, if the time should ever come when I personally recognize that I have a duty to die, but I can't bring myself to bring about my death, I will have to ask for forgiveness. I will have to have a good excuse for it. I hope, this is Hardwig talking, I think. I hope I have the willpower to end my life on the ground that it's the right thing to do, that I have a duty to do it, but I may not. People don't always do their duty. we are sometimes weak-willed. In fact, we're often weak-willed. When it comes to doing difficult things, we fail. We can't summon the courage to do it. So it's interesting. Hardwig is now 80 years old. I believe he's still alive. I've seen nothing to indicate that he's died. At the age of 80, he may well be a burden on his children, his grandchildren, perhaps great-grandchildren. And if so, then everything he's been arguing in this article comes into play, and it's starting to affect him personally. I wonder, I don't know the facts, but I'm certainly not calling Hardwig a hypocrite. I'm not, because I don't know the facts. But if Hardwig was a burden on his family, and if he has not taken steps to end his life, then that would suggest hypocrisy, wouldn't it? Because in this article, he argued that people should, and have a duty to, take steps to end their lives. So maybe, for all I know, Hardwig is in great health at 80. He's never felt better. He's productive. He's not a burden at all to any of his family members. For all I know, that's the case. And if that is the case, then he doesn't have a duty to die by his own reasoning, do you see? So whether Hardwig has a duty to die at present, it depends on his own situation, and I'm not privy to that. So don't think I'm criticizing Hardwig. I'm not. I'm speculating. I'm saying if this were the case, then this would be the case. If this other thing were the case, then this other thing would be the case. That's if-then sentences. Conditional. Okay, the only other thing I want to talk about today is the section entitled, Who Has a Duty to Die? And in this section, Hardwig admits right up front that he can't answer that question in the abstract. You can't say, here are the people who have a duty to die. Why can't you answer that in the abstract? And that's because every situation is different, morally different. He says, first of all, answers to this question will have to be very particular and contextual. He says that on page 38. Right? We have to go on a case-by-case basis. We can't just make a blanket, sweeping claim. Secondly, he says, our duties emerge through conversation with our loved ones. Here's how he puts it. He says, honest talk about difficult matters almost always strengthens relationships. So if you sit down with your family, once you think you may have become a burden to them, you can ask them frankly and pointedly, am I a burden to you? How are you holding up under the strains of caring for me? How are your finances? Am I draining your finances? I need to know that so I can make an informed decision about what to do. Perhaps they've been hiding their feelings about caring for you. You can try to elicit their feelings through the conversation to find out just what emotional toll your continued life is taking on them. So talk is good, Hardwig says. Conversation, honest, frank, open, is a good thing to sit down with your family members. Now, Hardwig, although he says we can't make any general abstract claims about who has a duty to die, he does give us some guidance. He says, here are some factors, and I'll quote him now, factors that make it more likely that one has a duty to die. Okay, so these are duty to die enhancing factors. Right? If any, to the extent that these factors apply to your situation, you are more likely to have a duty to die. So let's run through them. I have 7. I've gleaned 7 of them from his essay. Number 1, and this one's from page 38. Some of them are on page 39. In fact, all the rest of them are on 39. The first one is from 38. Here's what he says, quote, when continuing to live will impose significant burdens, emotional burdens, extensive caregiving, destruction of life plans, and yes, financial hardship on your family and loved ones. So to the extent that that's true, to that extent, you have a duty to die. Okay, it's a factor that you should look into, that you should take into account, right? Are you imposing a burden on your family and other loved ones? And if so, is it a significant burden? And exactly what kind of burden is it? Is it an emotional burden? Does it involve time for caregiving? Is it financial? Is it costly to your family? Does it adversely affect their life plans? Does it even destroy their life plans in some way? So that's something you should keep in mind if you're in a situation where you're deciding whether to bring about your death. Number 2, quote, a duty to die becomes greater as you grow older, unquote. Now that's interesting to me for the following reason. Some people are robustly healthy in their old age. I mean, Thomas Hobbes died at the age of 90, the great British philosopher, and he was working hard until the end, right? Writing and enjoying his life. Immanuel Kant died at the age of 80, and while the final year or so of his life was a period of decline, mental and otherwise, he was writing furiously in his 70s. Right? He was productive, active, alert. He was quite old. Right? He was in his late 70s and still busy writing and publishing and maybe even doing some teaching on the side because he enjoyed teaching. So other people in their 50s and 60s are already debilitated in various ways, mentally declining, physically declining, and so on. So why would Hardwig suggest that as you get older, your duty to die grows stronger? He must be talking about averages. On average, the older you get, the more debilitated you become and the more of a burden you become on your loved ones. Okay, so I think that's the only meaning we should assign to that. And I don't think Hardwig for a moment thinks that pure age alone makes the difference. For the reasons I just gave, he's well aware of Kant and Hobbes and other scholars and other people in different walks of life, that they remain active and busy and productive, and that they continue to enjoy their lives, and maybe are not yet a burden on their loved ones, or much of a burden. Okay, so that's the second factor, and I'm calling it into question. I'm saying it's puzzling because age alone shouldn't matter. It's the amount of burden you've become. Third, when you've already lived a full and rich life. So imagine someone who has lived a full and rich life and has now become a burden. You are more likely to have a duty to die than if you have not yet lived a full and rich life. Maybe there's some things that you still want to do and haven't been able to do. So your life isn't full yet. In fact, I think that's what the term bucket list means. We all have a bucket list, things we'd like to do while we still have a chance to do them. Maybe you've never seen the great national parks, Yosemite, Yellowstone, Glacier, and so forth. Well, there's still time, as long as you're alive, to do those things. You don't have to be particularly robust or energetic to do them either. You can see them from a vehicle. Right? You can even do that from a wheelchair. If you have a wheelchair-equipped vehicle, you can drive into these great parks. You can park and get out and move around in your device, wheelchair, for example, and enjoy these wonderful spectacles. So a bucket list would be things you would like to do while you still can. And some people have done almost everything they wanted to do. They may have had a thriving career, a fulfilling career, a family where the children and grandchildren are now grown and have careers of their own. You've traveled, you've written books, whatever your plans were, you've accomplished most of those things, maybe all of those things. If that's true, then you're more likely to have a duty to die, okay? Because you've had already a rich and fulfilling life. Okay, next item, number 4. Your loved ones' lives have already been difficult or impoverished. So imagine two situations that are alike in all respects except the following. I got to remember which hand I'm using. In this situation, your family members have not been impoverished. They've not had difficult lives. They've had good lives so far. In this situation, your family members have already had difficulties, problems. Their lives have been impoverished. Okay, as between these two situations, in which of them are you more likely to have a duty to die? It would be this one, where your family members have already suffered. They've already suffered from deprivation. They've already had rough lives, impoverished lives. Right? That enhances your duty to die. Whereas if your children have not suffered much as a result of their own choices and their own lives, maybe your duty to die is lessened in that situation, okay? Because you haven't really imposed on them. Right? They've had good lives in spite of your condition. So that's the fourth factor. You have to look not only at whether you've accomplished all that you hope to, or most of what you hope to, but you have to look at the quality of the lives of your loved ones. And if they've suffered and been deprived, then that increases your duty to end your life so that they have a chance to rebuild their lives and have meaningful and happy lives. Number 5 of 7, your loved ones have already made great contributions, perhaps even sacrifices, to make your life a good one. So there are a couple of situations here. In one case, your loved ones have not made many, if any, contributions to your well-being. In the other one, they already have made great contributions to you. So of those two situations, your duty to die would be greater in the second case, where they've already made great sacrifices or great contributions to you. They've already done a lot for you. So you should give back by ending your life and allowing them to flourish. Number 6, when the part of you that is loved will soon be gone or seriously compromised. So here he seems to be thinking of cases where your mental life is declining, right? Maybe your physical life as well. So you're going into cognitive decline. And if you've ever known someone in that condition, it's quite sad. People lose their memory. They are unable to recognize loved ones and so on. It's very sad to see that happen, but it does to many people. So if you are in that condition, if you know that you're declining mentally and physically, that increases your duty to die. Your duty is, you're more likely to have a duty to die in that situation where you'll soon be gone. Even if you're physically there, it won't be the same person. It won't be you any longer. It won't be the same person with the same memories and personality traits and that sort of thing. And finally, number 7, you've lived a relatively lavish lifestyle instead of saving for illness or old age. Now that's interesting because this one seems to be fault-based. In other words, this one heaps blame on you. If you've lived a lavish life and now find that you lack resources and are dependent on your family members to take care of you financially, that's your fault. Right? You didn't live properly if you let that happen. You shouldn't have lived so lavishly when early in your life, to the point when you've left yourself dependent financially on your loved ones. So you're more likely to have a duty to die when you were at fault for your own predicament now. Okay? You made bad decisions about how to invest and what to do with your resources, and now the consequences of that is that you have a duty to die. I know that sounds harsh, but Uh, Hardwig wants there to be some responsibility. I'm calling it fault, but it's really just taking responsibility for your own life choices. So the moral of the story is if you want to avoid having a duty to die or increase the likelihood of avoiding a duty to die, is be wise in expending resources when you're younger. Now, keep in mind what Hardwig is saying. If you save money for later in your life so that you can be fairly independent of your loved ones financially, you're less likely to have a duty to die because you won't be a burden. You're not as likely to be a burden on your loved ones if you have resources to pay for your care. So it's an additional reason to be prudent when you're younger and healthy and working. Save money so that you don't incur a duty to die. Now, I say, if you're reading along in my notes, at the bottom of my notes, page 6, I say, query, will these factors have a disparate impact on rich and poor, black and white, old and young, male and female? Does it matter? I can imagine someone saying it does matter. If there are racial injustices in society, if African Americans, for example, have been treated unjustly and are still feeling the effects of past injustices, then if we link the duty to die to having the financial resources to take care of yourself, that's going to come at a significant cost to African Americans, right? Because they don't have the same opportunities, and therefore because they are less likely to have the resources to take care of themselves when they're older and more debilitated, they're going to have a duty to die at a greater degree than, say, non-African Americans. And the argument is that that's unjust and unfair. In other words, Hardwig's argument has a kind of a built-in bias in favor of certain races or sexes or ethnicities, and that arguably is unfair. So Hardwig doesn't mention any of this. I'm simply, when I said query, that's just a term that just means question, right? Interesting question, a question that should be discussed and tried to answer. Okay, one more point, two more points, but they're both quick. Can the incompetent have a duty to die? Hardwig's answer is no. People who are currently incompetent cannot be said to have a duty to die. And that's because they can't be said to have any duties. If you're incompetent, you are beyond the possibility that you can have a duty to do something. But there's a catch. On page 39, Hardwig says, my obligation may be to die while I'm still competent. So if you're mentally declining, if you understand that you are becoming incompetent by the day, you cannot have a duty once you've become incompetent. But you can have a duty now to take steps to end your life before you become incompetent. Because then you're going to become a burden on your loved ones. They're not only going to have to care for you, but they're going to have to make decisions for you once you become incompetent, unless you've specified someone else to make those decisions other than your family. There's a very sad case of a philosopher, Michael Bales. You can see in my notes, Bayles. Mike, as he was called by his friends, Mike Bales was a terrific philosopher. Published many important books and articles. I've read many of his works. They're clear, they're insightful. He was truly a gifted philosopher. At the age of just about 50 years, he killed himself. And as his friends and colleagues struggled to understand it, because he was apparently in good health and could have lived many, many years longer, and he wasn't a burden on anybody, but he killed himself anyway. And when his colleagues and family members looked into his last few years, they found that he was undertaking fewer and fewer obligations as his 50th birthday approached. For example, his graduate students would ask him to supervise their dissertations. They would ask him to serve on their committees. And for about a year before he died, before he killed himself, he had been declining these requests. So when a student asked, Professor Bales, would you supervise my dissertation? I'm just about to get started on it. He would find a reason to decline it. And now, once he killed himself, everyone understood why. He didn't want to die with any outstanding obligations. In fact, here's what's really sad. He had submitted a book manuscript to a publisher, and he was awaiting a decision. And as I recall, I'm not going to check my facts right now, but as I recall, the day the letter came in the mail from the publisher saying, we accept your book for publication, he killed himself. He wanted to make sure that the book would get published. In other words, he wanted to make sure that the publisher didn't ask him to make changes to it. When the publisher said, we're going to go ahead and publish, he said, my work is done. I have no outstanding obligations. And he killed himself. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for him, for his family, for philosophy. I never knew him. I've read a couple of accounts of his life and death. It seems to me as though Bales agreed with Hardwig that he should not become a burden to his friends, loved ones, colleagues, or anyone else. And I think he thought that at the age of 50, he would start declining physically and mentally. And he just didn't want to live in decline. He thought, I want to die at the peak of my powers before I begin to decline. And he ended his life. It's a very sad story and tragic in some ways as well. Okay, the final thing I want to say is, according to Hardwig on page 40, we can find meaning in our lives by making this awesome decision, this awful decision about whether to end our lives. He says we can conquer death only by finding meaning in it. That's really the only way to conquer death. We're all going to die, and you can either find some meaning in your life and your death or not. And if you find meaning in your life, if you live your life without regrets, in anticipation of your own death, that is a way of conquering death. It's a way of creating meaning for your life and your death. So that's a nice way to end his essay, I think. He brings it back, the whole thing back to the meaning of life. And a good death can be part of a good life, so to speak. Okay, that's enough. We're a little over an hour in. That completes my discussion of Hardwig. There will be proportionately as many questions on Hardwig as the amount of time we spent on his essay. So the exam is Thursday, 2 days from today, 8 in the morning till 8 in the evening. Once you go in, you have 75 minutes to complete the exam. Make sure you take note of your score just as you complete it so you'll know. If for some reason you don't see it, you can always write to me. And I'll say good luck in your studies, and I'll see you back on the computer about a week from now, either next Tuesday or perhaps Wednesday, right? So you get 2 lectures next week on the reading by David Shaw, and I'm going to be posting that stuff in the next few days so you can get ahead. All right, have a great day, and good luck in your studying.